Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. Today I'm doing a weekly reads, weekly review type of thing. And I've got 9 books, I think it is, so we'll get to it because these always end up being longer than I expect. Importantly, there's timestamps below, so if you don't want to hear about a particular book, you can just skip ahead. First book I consumed was on audio. Today, A Woman Went Mad in the Supermarket. Stories by Hilma. Wolitzer. I give this 3 stars. I read this on Monday, so the very first day of the week for these weekly things, and it's already like I can barely remember a thing, which is kind of funny because I remember reading a story that was very like hypersexual in it and thought it was very like shock value to remember the collection, and now it completely escapes me what the context even around it or the even sex act thing was. But yeah, so completely forgettable. I remember it being very competent. It is written I think in the 60s, and then there's one story that is updated for COVID, which was more prescient. But the idea in the theme in the collection is that all of these stories are still pertinent. They still are feminist issues to be discussed. There's still, depict how little time has changed, and in some ways how much it has changed, but mostly in a sociological sense it has been a failure for women's rights. Not a complete failure, but we would have thought we'd be farther along, right? I gave it a 3 stars, competent, whatever. It's how most short story collections generally end up for me. Then I read Velvet Was the Night, Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This I gave 3 stars as well. Her books I find have always been like really great with their concepts, and they have generally a pretty cool conceit about them. But in the telling, it usually ends up navigating to a place where she's not engaging with the interesting stuff that I would expect from the concept and the premise. In this case, it is about a woman who is very like kind of bland, kind of catty, a little bit older, and it's in a sort of like neo-noir Cuba 60s, I believe, if I recall the setting correctly. And her next door neighbor, who's extremely beautiful and is kind of like the opposite of her, ends up asking her for a favor where she takes her possessions and some money and stuff and brings it to her friend at a bar, but ends up not ever showing up, so she disappears. And then she works with the friend to sort of engage with this mystery and kind of exfoliate some of the more stranger patterns she has established in her life, and her personality quirks, traits, stuff like that. So it's coupled, like there's sort of like a romance subplot. There's the missing girl subplot. It expounds on like women going missing in general, sexism, but mostly it's all from the perspective of this extremely uninteresting character. And so it constantly loses all of the narrative tension that you would assume from the setup. And yeah, it just kind of petered out. Our Wives Under the Sea, Julia Armfield. This book was great. I saw this on Bob the Booker's channel, and I think somebody else after that. I can't remember who, but both people talked about it in glowing terms. Oh, it was Bite-Sized Chats. Sean the Book Maniac had somebody on who talked about this a little bit more in depth. I think it was like a 10-minute conversation, and both people really liked it. Thankfully, I had already ordered it, and thankfully I got the British cover because, of course, the American one is trash. Another 90s movie, stupid font thing going on. Anyway, this is a very subjective work that focuses on the interpersonal dynamics between a lesbian couple who are going through something, I would say, fairly existential and metaphorical, but because it's subjective, you kind of have to decide that for yourself as you consume it. So it's kind of one of those like unspoilery type of books, but there is a kind of plot. Essentially, what happened, I put in quotation marks ostensibly, is the wife is a biologist, I believe, and she goes on deep sea dives in submarines. She goes on one such dive. She is missing, it's supposed to be 3 weeks, but it is like 6 months that she's gone. She returns and is kind of like much changed, and that's where the sort of horror elements come into this. She starts acting differently. She has physical, excuse me, she has physical reactions that like don't make sense. They're sort of like surrealistic or supernatural, again, kind of subjective in what's happening, but it parallels the troubles that are happening with them and their actual relationship. So they go to couples counseling at one point. Each chapter vacillates between one woman's present day accounting of what has happened as she reflects on the past as well. And then the other chapters are from the wife's perspective that is down in the sea and what happened in that deep sea event, basically, which is, I think most people expect the horror to be happening in that segment, but it actually is more in the present day circumstance, which is interesting. It kind of reminded me of A Passage North with interiority. Like, it's very, yeah, she returned, she's different, and there's kind of a plot playing out, but it's more about a very solipsistic, internal, tumultuous thing that she is working through, and her kind of definition of herself, and not being able to kind of figure out what's going on with her or her relationship. And then it becomes sort of a, I would say altogether like metaphor for grief, the sort of shattering of a self, the mourning of something past and the moving into something new, and how that sort of completely recreates a person. Like, it's very, like I said, subjective. I view it as something that is highly effective for me. The pacing does get a little hard throughout the middle, and you will not find definitive answers as to like what is specifically going on. So if you're the type of reader that needs those kind of concrete ideas and plot beats, you won't like it. But if you're a subjective reader like me, I think you'll enjoy it quite a bit. The language is fantastic. The prose are great. The descriptions are fantastic. It is not overwritten. And it's, yeah, absolutely something that you just sink right into. So it definitely made me think of A Passage North, except like queer, a little bit of horror elements, definitely sapphic, not graphic in a sexual sense, and yeah, just very thought-provoking, I thought. On audio, I consumed The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez, I think you would pronounce that as. 4 stars. This was almost a 5-star read for me, but there's a lot of caveats in this one because it is pretty strange science fiction. The cover made me think of YA. It's not. It's definitely adult fiction. The beginning starts off, you could think of the first half of the book, maybe 3/4. I'm not too sure because it's an audiobook. It's hard to gauge specifically where the parts are. But at least for the first few parts of this, it is a different medium through which it is working. So in the first part, there is like a short story, and it does not focus on the main character of the story. It is a relationship that blossoms from somebody who is an interstellar traveler and somebody who is like a non-transient person, like somebody who lives on the planet that is being visited by that person. And because of time being subjective, the person who lives there is going through a number of years, while the person is only, who is traveling is only experienced like a little bit of time. They're barely aging type of deal. And it's about that relationship, and it was just fantastic. Apparently it was written apart from this story completely and then kind of put in for additional context, and I loved it. Some people don't like that it's that and then it is reframed, and then it's reframed again, but I like it a lot. Afterwards, there is a sapphic queer romance story that is essentially centered on a person who is probably on the spectrum, but I don't think it's ever made explicit. Difficulties in communication type of trope happening, and the decision between work and love, and kind of a similar sort of push-pull thing as the first short story. But it is a lot more self-contained and definitely feels like it is part of the larger narrative, more so than the first one, and is longer than a short story. It also features one of the characters that's predominant in it, as does the first one, but in a more peripheral way, which is why I think it still comes together for me. After that, we switch into a crew that is on a mission, and throughout this, essentially there is a mystery angle being planted in which there is I don't want to really give that away. There's a mystery planted in each of these as seeds, where both of the characters in them don't know a specific thing that is going to happen in the future that the reader is continually getting like kind of breadcrumbs for. And the mystery component is the main thrust of the story, and on that last sort of narrative framing, basically. The all new characters are introduced each time, and then it's sort of like a found family thing, a journey thing, and a nestled mystery combination that is happening. The language is fantastic. The prose are incredible. I loved the prose so much. It feels like a poet has written them, but it's very grounded in character work, character decisions, and the emotions of the actual characters. Just a very inclusive, fully representative, very articulate book that fell just a tiny bit short with its pacing. And if you don't like the multiple different framings as you go along, kind of not really being situated to know who's the protagonist or what the mystery is, even for at least half of the book, I think. Again, hard to gauge on the audiobook. Maybe it's not for you, but I absolutely loved it. Then I consumed Evil Eye by Madhuri Shekar. This is a 4-star read, short story novella type deal. That's one of those Audible originals where they kind of produce their own thing. It's not based on another work. They get an author to write it, then they produce it specifically on audio for the central conceit of whatever the story is. In this case, it's all through phone calls, and voicemails. So the entire thing is through that. You have to kind of like piece together what is happening. And it's about a woman who is in America, I believe, a daughter of like a pretty traditional, it seems like, conservative Muslim family with a kind of overbearing mother. And the mother is like very quintessential, but done well. Like, it's not a caricature, I think. She's obviously very caring of her daughter. She's a little bit worried about marriage. Wants the best for her, not very good at communicating things, and there's sort of like an alienation between the two. But when the daughter meets a man who's too good to be true, essentially the mother's piecing together, for the mystery component, different indications that this guy is not who he says he is and is bad for her. And I'll say no more than that, I think, because it's only like an hour and a half. So yeah, but I thought the mystery component was really good. There is a belief/supernatural component to it, which might alienate some people. I was willing to roll with it. It does somewhat come out of nowhere because it feels like it's just going to be like a basic thriller/mystery, but for me it worked. I liked it a lot. I gave it 3 or 4 stars. The infamous Stoner, John Williams. I gave this 5 stars, rounded up from 4.5. So this is billed as like the perfect novel type deal, and I thought it was quite smart. It isn't perfect, that's for sure, I think, but I can see why people enjoy it so much. It is about a farm boy who gets the opportunity to go to university. Essentially, his parents cobble together all the money that they can manage to send him to then when the universities were fairly cheap. Not to like an Ivy League one, but a pretty good university. He takes English, he starts learning things, he starts staying on. It ignites like a passion in him that he wasn't able to find elsewhere, especially not in rural work, basically. And he has like a fairly normal life. It seems like ostensibly he's a person who is kind of like quintessential American academic. He sort of recedes, and this becomes like a reoccurring theme for Stoner, where essentially he is a very non-dominating but stick to your principles, very like non-confrontational intellectual person. And each of the different conflicts introduced into the book essentially showcase ways in which he, rather than takes a stand or ignites a conflict in a normal novel, he sort of sticks to the underlying principles that he's established for his entire life, which both that seems sort of lackluster and lacking drama, but still makes sense and still feel wonderfully captured in the actual prose. And interestingly, I have a fairly different reading of this book than other people. It chronicles his entire life, and essentially at the end of it, and you know this very at the beginning of the book, it kind of is a beginning at the ending, and then let me tell you my story type deal. It is very like subjective, I guess, in what it is trying to say about Stoner's life. Most people, it seems like, take away from it that he is had a sort of like principled, beautiful life despite the, I would say, kind of like cowardice that he exemplifies in most of his conflicts. He has a principled friend that goes away to war, and the result of which kind of galvanizes his opinions on how to proceed with his life. And for me, the actual triumph of the book is sort of the opposite takeaway of what everybody else that I've seen in reviews take away from it, which was that it is a critique of the actual philosophies and fundamental underpinnings of this person, right? Like his stoicism and his fundamental principles, as I said, guide him to a life in which he has not accomplished the things that he has wanted to, nor has it actually galvanized him in the ways in his life that he would have liked it to have been, and the reader, most likely. And so for me, it feels like a very nuanced and critical thought on some of the more stereotypical thoughts on academia itself, academics themselves, and how they purport to negotiate the world and navigate it. Like, it's sort of the, if you're arguing on the internet of a critique on a book or whatever, there's always that stoic guy who is very like, emotions don't come into this argument. I have these certain facts. Here's my thesis. You can't argue with this. This is my point type guy, you know, that everybody's always run into. And it's always missing the entire point of everything, generally, to me. Like, to divorce the person's identity, their humanity, their emotions from the argument that they're articulating, and then usually calling it identity politics if they're conservative. It's sort of attacking that notion in a critical level, which is what I thought was fascinating by depicting it in the entire life of an individual who's thought it best to subscribe to that. But in the subjective scene that I'm thinking of at the end, I find that even he thinks that, you know, his approach to life was quite lacking. Not that it was quite beautiful and had a full life and had very few regrets and stuff. That's not, I take away the exact opposite. So I thought that was interesting. If you've read Stoner, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And yeah, let's have a discussion. Seems like everybody's read Stoner. I'm late to the party, I guess. Next, I read a wonderful buddy read, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, Philip K. Dick, with Gemma from Gemma's Books. Sarah, who I can't remember her channel, but I'll link it below if I can find it. It was the first interaction that I had with her. Sandy from Miss Reads a Lot, and I believe that's it. Hopefully I'm not missing anybody. And this is the first time that I consumed this somehow, even though Blade Runner is my favorite book or movie of all time. So I wanted to read the book. It is quite different, as people, warned me throughout my entire adult life. And in some ways it held up, in some ways it didn't to my expectations, but I think is like inevitable in a work like this. Like, I try to pick up a book and let it work on me, and those are the only expectations that fit it, but this is a book that's so ingrained in the cultural consciousness, and I've consumed the work that it's based on, that I think that's fairly impossible. And I have a lot of thoughts about this, so I'm going to do a standalone review of this, I think, in the coming days. So look forward to that, because I can't rightly do it in just a few minutes. Next, I read, what did I read? Dracula by Bram Stoker. This is the first paper mill classic one that I think I've consumed. I'm not sure. And it's a little beat up. If you see, they like taped the ribbon back onto it. So I don't know, I must have got it as a scratch and dent copy or something like that. I don't have too much to say about this. It's Dracula. It did surpass my expectations. I gave it 4 stars. I didn't know it was like found artifacts in the form of like epistolary stuff, from logbooks to journal entries to really some contrived stuff, actually, to make the narrative cohesive. It asks quite a bit of the reader in that respect, but if you're willing to suspend your disbelief around the actual character of Dracula and vampires and the various things that are happening in the book, maybe it'll be fine. For me, it tripped me up a little bit, because if you've seen other books that I've reviewed, diegetic issues in books is sort of a problem that I have, like Son of the House. For one thing, didn't work for me primarily because the central conceit there didn't work. Like, when you say that this story is about these people who are telling themselves their life story, and then you shift into a narrative framework that isn't that, it doesn't work. Similarly with this, it is very uneven. Some of the time, it gets away with it. Like, they're telling each other's letters, and it obviously is including stuff that it otherwise wouldn't include. You have to, suspend your disbelief around the notion that they have to like, do they have eidetic memories or whatever? Like, how are they recounting all of this stuff so perfectly, right? But as long as it's not going to the weird parts where, like, they find a logbook of a captain who's dead on a ship, and that continues the narrative, you're like, all right, I guess so. Let's just roll with it. And if you're able to do that, I think you'll be fine. It's very atmospheric, very like Victorian, overwritten prose in terms of like description, but I really like that. I found the prose to be like really high on specificity. I like that the characters are kind of like against their own type, because if you, like me, have consumed other versions of Dracula, you might be surprised at the characters. Like Van Helsing, he's much more like soft boy basically in this. Like, he's very kind, gentlemanly, very worried for everybody's safety, and not like macho and sporting a gun and like basically a gunfighter type deal. And the women have a little bit more agency than I actually expected. There is a lot more plot beats than I knew, obviously, because the movie truncates it quite a bit. The dialogue is just fantastic. It's dripping and oozing. It's got its little underlying eroticism going on as well. I thought it would be a little bit more queer reading, but maybe I was just not privy to some of the stuff that was going on there because I haven't really consumed Victorian lit that much. But yeah, I mean, I don't have too much to say about it. I just thought it was really fun. It's a good gothic horror thriller romp, and it's paced out very nicely. Like, chapters are 2-3 pages of letters. It's a little bit odd, actually, because it'll usually be the same letter, continued, continued, continued. So, I don't know, I guess it's just for accessibility or something like that. But, yeah, fantastic. Don't regret buying it whatsoever. Don Quixote. There we go, Don Quixote. This book, similarly, I don't have too much to say on. I gave it 4 stars because it exceeded my expectations, but it's very strange because I can't say I enjoyed consuming it either. So it's more like admiring it for its craft than actually enjoying it, knowing that like the characters will stay with me, or the specific plot beats were interesting or compelling or memorable or anything like that. What I got out of it primarily is the high-level concept. And my neighbor's cutting wood, I guess, so we'll see how that plays out on the audio. Basically, what I like about this a lot is the initial concept of this book. The Don Quixote is a ostensibly regular dude who reads a lot of chivalric type of literature, basically colonizes or indoctrinates him, and he decides that, through madness or insanity or what have you, that is how he's going to perceive life now. And so wherever he goes, he imagines castles as inns, or regular commoners as beautiful women, courtesans, damsels in distress, things like that. And the interesting notion about that to me is that he is able to, Cervantes, that is, the author, is able to demonstrate how ludicrous it is for the people of upper class to insinuate their notions of social constructs on everybody else as well. And how they enforce it, of course, is through violence and through sort of charismatic principles, like qualities, like getting elected, convincing people this is a way in a democratic kind of way, or not. And so anyway, so the larger ideas, the concept of critiquing essentially fundamental puritanical notions ingrained in English culture, Western culture, is like really fascinating because it shows literally in how he functions and interacts with people how either ludicrous or violent or troublesome or plain like dysfunctional in other ways. For instance, the famous windmill scene, he imagines something else, he imagines he can take it on, and so there's limitations to his worldview, obviously, like the physical limitations of things cannot be altered however your imagination functions. But in sort of pushing your worldviews, your social constructs onto other people using violence, I think it was like a very potent and interesting thing to put into a book. The fourth wall breaking stuff didn't super work for me, especially when it spoils chapters ahead of time, stuff like that. There's some Monty Python type humor stuff that did land for me. Usually the higher brow stuff works, lower brow doesn't. People shitting their pants, stuff like that. Not into it. Granular interactions, like the prose style and stuff like that, all good. I just didn't really get into it. Thankful I'm done with it. Glad I still read it, but the best things that I like about it are concept-wise, so it did feel like kind of droning on and a slog to consume for sure. And yeah, that's Quixote. That was my week in reading. Let me know what you've been reading, what you've been enjoying. Let me know your thoughts on any of these books, and I'll see you next video. Bye.